Hey guys, tonight we're taking a gentle stroll back in time, slipping into the curiously restrictive world of medieval European sumptuary laws. Imagine for a moment that you've just woken up in, say, 14th century Florence. And feel free to let me know in the comments where you're re-listening from and what time it is for you right now. You stretch, perhaps stifle a yawn, and glance at your wardrobe. But wait. It's not just about what you wear, but what you're wearing says about you, and what that might imply about the state of society. While not strictly about daily attire, it speaks to the same underlying impulse, a desire to prevent excessive display and maintain a perceived equilibrium. You can almost picture the Athenian busybody tutting over a funeral procession that was just a bit too opulent, or a dowry that was simply too much. Now, fast forward a millennium or so, and you find yourself squarely in the heart of medieval Europe, where these laws truly hit their stride, evolving into a bewildering tapestry of regulations. But why, you might ask, did medieval rulers and city councils suddenly become so intensely interested in the length of your sleeves or the quality of your shoes? It wasn't just a sudden burst of fashion policing, though that certainly played a part. The church, a dominant force in medieval life, often preached against pride, vanity, and gluttony. In some German towns, there were regulations not just on clothing, or if they were more a reflection of elite anxieties about a changing world and the rise of a wealthy merchant class. Was it truly about piety, or was it about keeping the newly rich from looking too much like the old money? The lines, as you might imagine, were often blurred. But one thing is clear. Your wardrobe was never just your own in the Middle Ages. It was a statement, a political declaration, and a moral battleground, all wrapped up in wool, linen, and occasionally a very long, pointy shoe. But on the size of the ruffs worn around the neck, or even the number of pleats in a lady's skirt. One particularly fascinating and slightly humorous example comes from 14th century England, where laws attempted to dictate the length of the poulins, those wonderfully long, pointed shoes that were all the rage. The longer your point, the higher your status. But these shoes became so absurdly long that people would trip over them, or even have to tie the points up to their knees when walking. The law specified that knights could have 2-foot-long points, esquires 1.5 feet, and commoners, well, they were lucky if their toes weren't squashed against the end. It was the medieval equivalent of wearing ridiculously oversized sneakers, but with legal repercussions. Imagine trying to walk gracefully down a muddy medieval street with foot-long extensions on your shoes. A true fashion hazard. Ostentatious display was seen as sinful, a distraction from piety, and a challenge to Christian humility. These laws, therefore, were often framed as a means to encourage moderation and prevent moral decay. You might think you're just sporting a jaunty feather in your cap, but to a zealous priest, you might be inviting divine wrath upon the whole community. It was believed that God might punish an entire town for the sinful excesses of its inhabitants. So, your slightly too flashy tunic wasn't just an individual choice. It was a potential cosmic affront. It's a very human tendency, isn't it? To look at someone else's perceived excess. Medieval society was meticulously stratified, like a very tall, wobbly cake, with a king on top and peasants forming the base. The medieval economy was a delicate balance, and excessive spending on luxury goods, particularly by those who perhaps couldn't truly afford it, was seen as destabilizing. Gold thread, imported silks, fine furs. These were expensive. If everyone started decking themselves out in these costly items, it could drain local resources, inflate prices, and generally upset the delicate economic apple cart. Some laws even aimed to protect local industries by restricting the import of foreign textiles, encouraging the use of domestically produced wool and linen. So, while you might think you're just buying a nice cloak, the authorities might see it as an act of economic treason. It's a bit like today's arguments about supporting local businesses, but with significantly more legislative teeth. Everyone had their place, and it was crucial that this place was immediately recognizable. Your clothing, you see, was your visual ID card. A nobleman needed to look like a nobleman, a merchant like a merchant, and a peasant, well, a peasant. If a prosperous peasant started dressing like a minor knight, it could cause all sorts of confusion, leading to what the elites feared most, social mobility. Imagine the horror. Someone might mistake a particularly well-off serf for, heavens forbid, someone important. These laws were designed to keep everyone in their designated lane, sartorially speaking. It was about reinforcing the existing power structures, making it clear at a glance who is above whom in the grand pecking order. And think, someone really ought to do something about that. And often, that something became a law. For example, in ancient China during various dynasties, strict regulations dictated the colors, patterns, and materials permissible for different social classes. Were they genuinely about moral rectitude, or more about economic protectionism, trying to prevent commoners from looking too much like their betters? It's a fascinating debate, pondering whether human nature, with its inherent desire for display and distinction, can ever truly be legislated into submission. But for now, as we prepare to step into the medieval era, just hold on to that thought. The urge to control what people wear is a very, very old one, predating Netflix and even indoor plumbing. The emperor, of course, got to wear yellow, a color typically reserved for royalty, while commoners were relegated to less vibrant, earthier tones. You wouldn't catch a farmer strolling through the market in imperial yellow, not unless they fancied a rather swift and unfortunate encounter with the local authorities. It was a visual shorthand, an immediate identifier of your place in the grand tapestry of society. Before you even consider reaching for that rather fetching red velvet doublet, or those shoes with the ridiculously long, pointy toes, the ones you just had to have, you need to pause. Because in this era, your sartorial choices weren't just about personal taste or comfort. They were a meticulously regulated declaration of your social standing, enforced by actual laws. You probably wouldn't last a day without inadvertently flaunting something you shouldn't, inviting a fine or, worse, public shame. It's almost comical how deeply intertwined your daily attire was with the very fabric of society. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather, our long winding pathway through the history of telling people what to wear, begins long before the clanking armor and towering cathedrals of the Middle Ages. The concept of sumptuary laws, these regulations designed to curb extravagance and enforce social hierarchies through dress and consumption, is remarkably ancient. You see, even in the grandeur of the Roman Republic, you'd find similar decrees. Take the Lex Appia, for instance, enacted in 215 BCE. This law, born out of the austerity of the Second Punic War, sought to limit the amount of gold women could wear, and the colors of their clothing, even restricting their use of chariots within a mile of Rome. Imagine you're trying to just nip down to the Forum for some olives, and suddenly your chariot is too flashy, or your toga has too many purple stripes. It wasn't about fashion per se, but about projecting an image of virtue and restraint during a time of national crisis. Of course, once the war was over, and Rome was swimming in Carthaginian loot, the ladies of Rome rather loudly and effectively protested its repeal. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief as they dug out their finest purple-dyed silks. This ancient precedent highlights a recurring theme. Sumptuary laws often arise from a perceived need to control public displays of wealth or maintain social order. One quirky tidbit, perhaps a little more obscure, comes from classical Athens, where laws were occasionally proposed, though not always enforced, to restrict the size of women's dowries or the cost of funerals. Historians still argue whether these early sumptuary laws were truly effective in curbing extravagance, or if they simply served as aspirational guidelines, frequently flouted by those with enough influence or cunning. So, you've got this ancient lineage of sumptuary laws, a dusty old family tree of rules telling folks what they could and couldn't adorn themselves with. One of the primary motivations, a mainstream historical fact you'll often encounter, was the preservation of the social hierarchy. Beyond simply maintaining the status quo, another significant driver was economic control. Then there was the rather less tangible, but equally powerful motivation, moral and religious concerns. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some sumptuary laws were incredibly specific, bordering on the absurd. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind these laws was genuinely about preserving social order and morality. So you're navigating this medieval world, constantly aware that your fashion choices are under scrutiny. It wasn't just that there were sumptuary laws, but what specifically they targeted. And let me tell you, the details get wonderfully, wonderfully granular. You might think, well, it's just about rich people showing off. But it was far more intricate than that. Furs weren't just for warmth. They were a massive status symbol. Gold and silver embroidery, precious jewels, elaborate buttons, and even the type of headwear were all fair game for regulation. Your belt buckle could land you in trouble if it was too ornate. The rings on your fingers, the chains around your neck, all subject to scrutiny. Even something as seemingly innocuous as a particularly fancy belt could be legislated against. But knowing the rules is one thing. Understanding how they were actually enforced, and more importantly, how people tried to get around them, is where the real fun begins. Because, let's be honest, human nature, with its inherent desire for self-expression, and perhaps a touch of rebellion, has always found ways to push boundaries, even when those boundaries are stitched into the fabric of society. Belts, in particular, were often a subtle signifier of wealth, with intricate buckles and expensive materials. These individuals would patrol the streets, attend public gatherings, and even sometimes peek into private homes to ensure compliance. One common tactic was simply to wear the forbidden garments at home or in private gatherings, reserving more modest attire for public appearances. It is the medieval equivalent of having a fabulous outfit for Instagram, but sticking to sweats for running errands. Another method was to disguise expensive materials. A rich silk might be worn as an underskirt, or a fur lining might be carefully concealed beneath an outer layer of plain wool, only visible when one sat down, perhaps with a slight, knowing flourish. It was a subtle rebellion, a quiet wink at the law. They were essentially the fashion Gestapo in the Middle Ages, meticulously noting infractions. For the truly wealthy, a fine was merely the cost of doing business, the price of expressing their status. It was cheaper, after all, than a noble uprising. This leads us to an ongoing scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of sumptuary laws was truly to enforce social order, or if they often served as a covert revenue-generating scheme for cash-strapped medieval governments. If enough wealthy individuals were willing to pay the fines to flout the rules, these laws could become a lucrative source of income. Was it truly about morality and hierarchy, or simply about squeezing a few extra coins out of the newly rich? It's a question that makes you ponder the motivations behind many historical laws, doesn't it? The dance between principle and profit is as old as civilization itself. One particularly amusing account, though its veracity is debated among historians, suggests that some of these officials would carry long poles to physically measure the length of ladies' veils or gentlemen's shoe points without having to get too close. Imagine strolling along, minding your own business, when suddenly a long stick pokes out and measures your hat. It's a wonderfully visual, if slightly undignified, image of medieval bureaucracy in action. You certainly wouldn't want to be caught with a veil that drapes just a whisker too far. It wasn't like modern police patrols looking for fashion violations. though you can almost imagine such a scene. Instead, it often fell to local officials, town criers, or even concerned citizens. Mainstream historical records show that fines were the most common form of punishment. If you were caught wearing forbidden fabric or sporting too many buttons, you'd be slapped with a monetary penalty. These fines could be quite substantial, designed to be a deterrent, particularly for those of the rising merchant class, who might have the means, but not the right, to dress above their station. Imagine you've just bought that gorgeous new velvet gown, only to have a city official measure your train and declare it 2 inches too long, resulting in a fine that could feed your family for a month. Talk about a fashion faux pas with real consequences. It's a bit like modern regulations on, say, the size of a diamond an engagement ring can have, but applied to every aspect of your daily outfit. In some communities, offenders might be forced to wear a distinctive mark or garment that highlighted their transgression. Or, perhaps even worse, their illicit finery might be confiscated and publicly displayed, stripped of its grandeur and serving as a stark warning to others. There's a subtle cruelty in that, isn't there? Not just taking away the object, but robbing it of its aspirational power and turning it into a symbol of shame. You can almost feel the collective gaze of your neighbors as your too opulent cloak is hung in the town square. Ermine, mink, and sable were the preserve of the elite, their softness and rarity screaming wealth. Yes, buttons. These weren't just functional fasteners. In the medieval period, elaborate buttons could be very costly, made from precious metals or intricately carved. So if you had too many buttons on your tunic, you might be seen as excessively extravagant. It's the ultimate example of micromanaging fashion, a constant reminder of the social order, rather than a rigid set of rules that were always followed to the letter. Were they truly about maintaining a sober society, or were they a constant, subtle psychological warfare waged by the elite against anyone aspiring to rise above their station? You have to wonder how many medieval fashionistas simply found clever ways to interpret the rules, or perhaps had a less ostentatious everyday outfit for when the local fashion police were on patrol. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? The ingenuity of defiance against even the most mundane of regulations. Imagine a medieval inspector counting your buttons. 1, 2, 3. Wait a minute, sir. Is that a 4th button on your cuff? Do you know what this means? You can almost hear the exasperated sighs of the tailor trying to keep up with the latest button count decrees. Commoners might wear rabbit or sheepskin, if they were lucky. While we touched on them, the specific material of these points was also sometimes regulated. Only nobles might have points reinforced with whalebone, allowing them to maintain their dramatic length, while commoners' shorter points would simply flop over. It was about creating a visual distinction right down to the very tip of your toes. Some laws even distinguished between the type of fur and where it could be used on a garment. You might be allowed a bit of rabbit fur trim, but a full sable lining? Absolutely not, unless you were a duke. It's like today if you decided to deck yourself out in a coat made entirely of rare orchid petals, visually striking, wildly impractical, and probably illegal for anyone but a botanical eccentric with diplomatic immunity. The primary targets of these laws were often luxurious fabrics and expensive dyes. Think about it. If you were a humble peasant, you'd be wearing undyed wool or coarse linen, maybe some homespun cloth in drab, natural shades. But if you were a noble, you'd be draped in silks, velvets, and brocades, often imported from far-off lands like China or Byzantium. And the colors, vibrant reds, deep blues, and particularly rich purples, were incredibly costly to produce, often requiring rare pigments or complex dyeing processes. Tyrian purple, for instance, derived from thousands of crushed murex snails, was so expensive it was almost exclusively reserved for royalty and high-ranking clergy. So if you, a mere merchant, dared to wear a purple cloak, you weren't just making a fashion statement. You were basically shouting, "Look at me. I'm defying the established order and probably have too much money. The laws would explicitly state who could wear what color and what type of fabric. It was a kaleidoscope of regulations, making sure everyone stayed in their assigned shade. Beyond fabrics and colors, furs were another huge point of contention. Then there were the trimmings and accessories. Here's a quirky tidbit that might make you chuckle. In some places, even the number of buttons you could have on your clothes was regulated. And let's not forget those infamous pull-ins again, those long pointed shoes. Historians still argue whether the complexity and sheer volume of these detailed sumptuary laws were genuinely enforceable, or if they were more of a deterrent. So, you're now intimately familiar with the perplexing array of thou shalt nots when it came to medieval attire. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was, as you might expect, a bit of a mixed bag. Beyond fines, public shaming was also a powerful tool. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit about enforcement. In certain Italian city-states, there were officials specifically designated as dress police or supervisors of luxury. Of course, with all these rules, people inevitably developed clever ways to circumvent them. And sometimes, people simply paid the fines and continued to dress as they pleased. You've seen how these laws rose, how they micromanaged medieval wardrobes, and how they were, to varying degrees, enforced and skirted. But like all grand historical trends, the era of widespread, aggressively enforced sumptuary laws eventually began to wane. The grand sartorial police force, with its measuring sticks and fines, slowly, gently, began to fade into history, leaving behind a curious legacy. The decline wasn't sudden, but rather a gradual softening stretching over centuries. We talked about those excessively long pull-ins. The idea that the state had the right to dictate such personal choices as one's clothing started to seem, to some, increasingly anachronistic and intrusive. While this was a very long and drawn-out process, the subtle currents of changing philosophical thought certainly played a role in undermining the rationale for such pervasive social control. The vibrant, sometimes ludicrous, tapestry of medieval sumptuary laws slowly unraveled, giving way to an era where, for better or worse, your fashion choices became increasingly your own. Allow the whispers of the past, the faint murmurs of forgotten fines and secret fur linings, to soften and become indistinct, like distant bells fading with the evening breeze. You've journeyed through a world where even your attire was a statement, a carefully regulated whisper in the grand chorus of society. But that world has long since settled into the quiet archives of history. There's no need to worry about the length of your sleeves tonight, or the number of pleats in your imagined tunic. Just the quiet hum of your room, perhaps the soft rustle of your blankets, and the calming certainty that such curious regulations no longer dictate your dreams. Let the images of medieval fashionistas, nervously adjusting their collars or subtly displaying a forbidden lining, become soft and blurry, like old tapestries seen through a comforting haze. All those rules, all that fuss, now just a gentle story, easing you into a peaceful quiet. As fashions became more extreme, the laws attempting to regulate them sometimes bordered on the farcical, making them difficult to enforce and often ridiculed. Was it a triumph of individual expression, or simply an acknowledgement that you can't truly legislate taste and aspiration? The debate continues, pondering whether similar, more subtle sumptuary codes exist in modern society, perhaps not through explicit laws, but through social pressures, brand exclusivity, and the quiet judgment of what is appropriate for one's station. We might not have laws telling us what color socks to wear, but the unspoken rules of dress still persist, don't they? Imagine a town council meeting debating the precise maximum circumference of a puffed sleeve, or the exact number of pleats allowed in a skirt for a burgher's wife. At some point, the sheer pettiness and difficulty of enforcement likely led to a collective rolling of eyes and a quiet decision to simply look the other way. When the laws become more of a joke than a serious legal instrument, their power naturally dissipates. One significant factor, a mainstream historical observation, was the rise of the merchant class and burgeoning capitalism. As new materials and styles emerged from global trade, and as production methods became more efficient, the concept of what constituted luxury began to shift. What was once rare and exclusive might become merely expensive, or even relatively accessible to a broader range of the population. Keeping up with the minutiae of every new trend with legislation became an administrative nightmare. Imagine trying to update a law every time a new shade of blue became fashionable or a new type of lace arrived from Flanders. The laws simply couldn't keep pace with the ever-accelerating whims of consumer desire. As trade routes expanded and new wealth was generated, the rigid social hierarchy that sumptuary laws were designed to protect began to buckle under economic pressure. Merchants, bankers, and successful artisans accumulated immense fortunes, often surpassing the old landed nobility in wealth. It became increasingly difficult, and frankly illogical, to tell someone with vast riches that they couldn't wear a certain fabric or jewel simply because their grandfather wasn't a duke. The sheer volume of new money and the social fluidity it created simply overwhelmed the old systems of control. It's a bit like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a teacup. Admirable effort, but ultimately futile. Another contributing factor was the changing nature of fashion itself. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, in some regions, the decline of sumptuary laws wasn't just about economics. It was also subtly influenced by the growing absurdity and impracticality of some regulations. Furthermore, the very concept of individual liberty began to gain traction, albeit slowly, as Europe moved towards the Enlightenment. Historians still argue whether the ultimate failure of sumptuary laws was due to their inherent unenforceability, the unstoppable force of economic change, or a fundamental shift in societal values. As the centuries rolled on, the concept of sumptuary laws largely faded, leaving behind fascinating glimpses into a world where your hat, your shoes, or even the trim on your cloak could determine your place in society and potentially land you in legal hot water. And now, as the gentle echoes of ancient Roman dress codes and medieval button counts begin to recede, let your mind drift from the intricate patterns of prohibited silks and the curious lengths of pointy shoes